When we form the past simple tense in English, we tend to just add an ed ending to regular verbs. So we might say, for instance, I kick, and that becomes kicked, right? So the ed ending is added at the end. This is in contrast to irregular verbs, where you simply have to memorize the ending or the change. If you have something like buy, that becomes bought. If you have something like eat, that becomes ate. There doesn't seem to be much of a pattern to that, and in that case, you just have to memorize the ending. But for most of these regular verbs, we add ed, and you might think, well, we're done then. But the tricky thing is that there are some spelling rules that are a bit unusual. And that's what we'll cover in this video, and I think even native speakers of English might find this very interesting because there are some unusual exceptions that are worth paying attention to. Okay, so let's start with verbs that end with a silent E. So silent E. An example would be something like I love or I bake. And you don't say I lovey or I love. That E is silent. And in those cases, we just add a D. So we don't add another E, we just add a D. Okay, so probably that one doesn't cause too much trouble. Let's go to the next one. And this has to do with verbs that end with a Y. So first of all, we have ones that end with a consonant and a Y. And an example here would be something like try, right? I try. You can see there's a consonant in the R, and then we have the Y ending. When we have this changes a little bit. The Y becomes an IE, and we're going to get tried. Now, we can contrast this with a situation where we have a vowel plus a Y. So a vowel plus a Y. And an example of this would be something like pray. So you can see the vowel and then the Y, and that simply becomes prayed. I prayed. Okay, the next ones have to do with consonants. So if we end with a consonant, so we're going to end our verb with a consonant after a single vowel. After a single vowel, then there are a couple of situations that can take place. Okay, so the first one is if the last syllable is stressed. So the last syllable is stressed. And sometimes it's much easier just to see what this looks like in practice. Okay, so the last syllable stressed. Let's have a look at one here. Defer. Okay, you can hear that there is, first of all, a consonant at the end after a single vowel. An example of something else would be a verb like tweak, right? Where we have two vowels and we add an ed ending quite regularly. But in this case, we have a consonant after a single vowel, but the stress falls at the end. Defer, not defer. Okay, so in this case, what we do is we actually double this consonant. This is going to become deferred with an extra R. By contrast, if we have the last syllable unstressed, okay, the last syllable is unstressed. An example would be flatter. Flatter, right? You can hear that the first one is stressed here. Then we just add the ed ending, and we don't double the consonant. That's kind of tricky, isn't it? But you really have to get an ear for that, and the more you start seeing the pattern, the easier it gets. One more example here. If we use something like stop, you can hear this is an O, that's a vowel before a consonant, and in this case there's only one syllable. So by nature we're gonna stress this, and that's why again we double the consonant. It becomes stopped. Few more cases here, few more instances where we have a tricky rule, and the next one has to do with ending with an L. Okay, what happens when we end with an L? This one actually has a lot of variation. So if you take a verb like cancel, and other examples would be travel, equal, there's lots of verbs that end with L. Do you add just the ed ending, or do you write it with an extra L? Do you double the consonant in this case? Well, if you are a British speaker of English, you tend to double the consonant. So this is very common in British English. In North American English, there's a lot more variation. So in North American English, you might see it with 2 L's, but you may also see it quite often with 1 L. And that can be kind of tricky, and it may be hard to know what to do. So just try to get used to that and make up your own mind as to what you prefer. But it is great to be aware of this distinction, because especially, or even native speakers of English struggle with this one all the time. Let's add with one last one here. And this has to do with verbs that end with a C. So let's say somebody says, I panicked. Panic. Okay. And when you have this in the regular present tense, you say I panic, but then when you form the past tense, you add a K, which is very strange, isn't it? I panicked, or I frolicked, or there's a bunch of other ones. There is one exception to this rule though, and this is a fairly contemporary verb. It's the verb sync. If you are syncing your files, you do not add the K, so you would say I synced, just adding the ED. Hopefully this doesn't confuse you too much. Hopefully you find this interesting and helpful. Those are the rules, the spelling rules for adding ED to form the past simple tense.